right, the clip we're about to watch is a recent conversation between Robert Sapolsky and Chris Williamson on his show Modern Wisdom. Specifically, it's the second half of the interview we're going to jump into, where the two of them get into a discussion about free will. And I'm going to go ahead and let them get into it. I'll give you some of my thoughts as we go along, but respect to Chris for having this discussion, and respect to Robert Sapolsky as well for elaborating on this and sharing his views. So let's go ahead and get the ball rolling.
We're talking about stress. We're talking about neurotransmitters and hormones, and some of that stuff's contentious, right? But largely people are interested in how to reduce stress and how it works and how the oxytocin and the serotonin and stuff all come together. Why did you decide to descend into the hellscape that is the free will discussion? Like, why is it so important to discuss this that you would put your own mental health on the line?
Well, when I was a fetus, there's this thing that happened. Well, when I was almost back to a fetus, I was 14 when I decided there's no free will whatsoever. As long as I was at it, it was one very tumultuous night. I also decided there's no God and there's no purpose to anything. And it's a huge, empty...
It's a rough evening for a 14-year-old.
Yeah. And I've been paying for those insights ever since. This was literally at 2 a.m. I woke up during a rather distressed week with all sorts of angsty things going on. And I woke up and I remember very clearly saying, oh, I get it. There's no God. And there's no free will. And I even quickly wrote down notes, which of course were incoherent because I was half asleep and I couldn't read them in the morning. But, I've been thinking this way forever. And, that's great. That's kind of what I've gotten to. And about 5 years ago, I wrote this book called Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. And it's basically, why do we do what we do? And the answer is because of what happened 1 second ago, and 1 minute ago, and an hour ago, and back to childhood and fetal life and genes and what culture your ancestors invented, because that's how your mother treated you and evolution and all that. And you got to take all of that into account. And literally 790 pages agonizingly later, this is what we're about. And in the aftermath, I did a lot of lecturing, and you'd go through a 50-minute version of all of this and Q&A afterward. And inevitably there'd be someone who would say, wow, if this is how stuff works, we may have less free will than we normally think. And I'd sort of say, you think? And I realized, for a surprising number of people who would do something as ridiculous as go to a lecture on a weeknight or something, this was revelatory and saying, okay, I thought this would be obvious after almost 800 pages of this download. Time to write something that says, yeah, not only is there much less than we think, there's no free will whatsoever, and we got to start functioning a little bit more as if that's the case. And thus I've sat, collecting cobwebs for the last 5 years, writing a sort of the sequel to that book. It's coming out October. It's called Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. And I take what is far and away a lunatic fringe stance, which is in saying that we have no free will whatsoever. All we are is the sum of our biology and its interactions with environment, and neither of which we had any fundamental control over. And that's who we are.
Okay, so that's the claim, but I want to touch on something he said earlier that stood out to me about his story. The fact that he formed this anti-free will view at the age of 14 is very interesting to me because, obviously he's a brilliant guy, but certainly I think it's safe to assume that at 14, there's probably a lot of stuff that you don't know yet when you're that age, even somebody that's as smart as he is. And it doesn't seem like he's considered that or questioned any of his views since then. And that's important because to me, a genuinely held worldview requires that you go through a period of questions and doubts and even insecurity, I would argue, to really test it and to identify the flaws that it may have. Science does this a lot in the way of peer review, PhD thesis review committees, and so on. And religion is really no exception to this. For example, I'm a Christian and I grew up in a Christian home. I went to a Christian school all my life. I went to church, and there was a period after high school when I went out into the world and I started to have doubts about all the things that my religion had taught me. And it took me almost a decade of exposing myself to other worldviews and beliefs before I started to truly appreciate the merits of my own background. And that's a common path for people that grow up in the church. They aren't prepared for the arguments of an opposing view, secular views, and that makes them question their faith. And I'm very thankful for that period of my life, actually, because it gave me the opportunity to lay aside some of the naive beliefs that I had acquired in childhood. And it challenged me to address these gaps in my understanding of the history and the science that seemed to be conflicting with my faith at first glance. And the idea of struggling with faith is an inherent concept that comes up again and again in the Bible and in many religions. But it doesn't sound to me like Sapolsky ever went through a period like that. It doesn't seem like he's wrestled with his own presuppositions. His philosophy, to me, is similar to a Christian fundamentalist who adopts a belief system at an early age and then proceeds throughout the rest of their life without questioning why they believe what they believe. Let's keep going.
So I kind of figured I would go try to convince some people of that and fully expect that's going to be wildly unsuccessful, but at least I don't have to try to frame my arguments in coherent paragraphs anymore.
Why do you think the conversation about free will is so animated?
Okay, quick, easy answer. It's quite literally the foundation of the belief system that animates our culture, our laws, culture, founding religion. It's all based on two principles. One, humans are made in the image of God. That's the first. And then God gave man free will, and that's what separates mankind from every other aspect of creation. We have the decision to choose between good and evil. Now, you can choose to not believe that, but that is why the issue is so controversial. And I think Sapolsky knows that. He's a brilliant guy. He truly is. And so I don't think he stumbled blindly into this territory. I think this is an intentional campaign on his part to deconstruct free will.
Because at first glance, and for the first 150 or so glances, it really sucks if we have no free will, if we are just biological machines, all of that. It really is terrible and demoralizing and frightening and all of that. And it's not by chance that what the polls show is 95% of philosophers who think about this are what you call compatibilists, which is they're willing to admit we're not made out of magic, like the world is made out of molecules and stuff like that. But somehow, this is where we still manage to have free will. And when you read between the lines, it's because half of them are saying, because damn, that would be depressing because we get we are me. Me. And where did me come from? And part of being me is that I've got some control over what I do. And this is incredibly central to our sense of well-being and mental health in lots of cases and all of that. But bummer, it doesn't work that way. And, I go through this agonizingly long book. The first half is why we have no free will, and here's the brains and the genes and, all of that.
So it's interesting that he brings up the fact that we do see our lives through a story, and I want to touch back in on that in a second. But first, I want to address the sort of reductionist, materialist proposition that he's setting up here, where we are just brains with neurons and genes, and that's all, like he said. So here's a question for Robert Sapolsky that he needs to answer if he wants to back up his claim that materialism is all that there is. How do you explain something like the placebo effect? Because if all we are is molecular interactions, then a sugar pill should have zero effect 100% of the time. But we know that's not the case. Placebos are effective against almost every symptom known to mankind, and it works in roughly 60% of patients. And that's a big problem for a reductionist materialist because it points to the very real impact of belief and choice on outcomes. And I mean, I could go on and on. There's a ton of medical examples here. If free will doesn't exist, then why do cancer patients who fight the illness, display a will to live, have better outcomes on average than patients who go through the same treatments, but give up hope and choose to give up? That's a choice. And if I had cancer, or if someone close to me had cancer, the last thing that I would do is tell them that they have no agency, that they have no free will, that their outcome is biologically pre-programmed and that's it. That would be a death sentence to them, surely. And I think Sapolsky should be able to see that even in the scientific literature.
And the second half of the book, which took me much longer to write because I still don't really have any good answers to this, is, oh my God, what if people actually started believing this? How are we supposed to function if we recognize that there's no free will, that agency is a myth? Oh my God, like what's the world supposed to look like? And the second half of the book is very feeble attempts at trying to get at that. And hopefully in the process, like deconstructing people's resistance to the notion that we have no free will.
Deconstructing people's resistance. That's clearly motivated by a postmodern philosophy. He's using social constructionist language here.
The first thing everybody immediately freaks out over, everybody's going to just run amok because there's no responsibility if you feel like there is none. And what a lot of science has shown is we're not going to run amok. We may run amok for the first afternoon. We're convinced of that. And like interesting research has shown, if you like unconsciously prime people to believe less in free will, they're more likely to cheat at a game 20 minutes later, stuff like that. But when you get people who have for a long time believed there's no free will, just as when you get people who for a long time have believed there is no God, they're exactly as ethical as people who believe there's abundant free will and it makes sense to hold us responsible for our actions, and just as ethical as people who believe there is a God who is watching and judging all of that. And sort of the key commonality is if you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, what's the source of meaning? What's the source of human goodness or any stuff like that? If you spent a lot of time thinking about it, in lots of ways, it doesn't matter if your conclusion is we have free will or we don't. There is a God or there isn't. There is a God who cares or any. If you've done the hard work of thinking about it, you're going to wind up being much more ethical than average. That's the first. We're not going to run amok.
Okay, so two unbelievably unsupported claims here that we need to address. So number one, he says a lot of science has shown that over long periods of time, people that don't believe in free will won't run amok. Okay, what science exactly are we talking about here? Where's this prototypical civilization where people supposedly haven't believed in free will while maintaining collective and cohesive communities and social structures over a long period of time? What test was that? Because I haven't seen it. This is the same issue that climate models and epidemiological models run into. The systems aren't complicated systems. They're complex systems. And to accurately model a complex system, you're required to have a model that's the same scale as the system itself that you're trying to represent. Because when you simplify that model, you're changing the dynamics such that you're going to have an impact on the predictive validity of the model. So I would like to see what study he's citing here. And second, this ahistorical claim that when you get people who have believed for a long time that there is no God, they're just as ethical as people who believe in God. Dr. Sapolsky, are you aware of the events that took place in the 20th century, right? I mean, I'm sure you're aware of what happened in a post-Catholic Soviet Union, Maoist China, and Nazi Germany for that matter, which by all accounts, materially and culturally speaking, was a very affluent society, but religiously, they were bankrupt. So many of the leaders were atheists. I'm sorry, but that claim just isn't true. If those are the two tenets that you're using to support your book, it seems like you need to do some more hard thinking on this, man. Okay, so let's keep going.
But then people freak out saying that still, there's going to be some people that run amok, and what, you're going to do nothing about them? You're just going to let murderers run around on the street because they're not responsible for their actions? And, that's an asinine worry, because we've got some great parallels. If you got a car and the brakes don't work, it's not safe. It's dangerous. You keep it off the streets because it's going to hurt people. And what you do is, if you can't fix it, you stick it in a garage and the car can't be driven anymore. But that doesn't mean it deserves to be locked up. That doesn't mean it's got a crappy soul or something like that. It's a broken machine. And protect society from it.
Yeah, I guess this sort of criminal side of this is a really interesting implication, right? Like, if does no free will mean that there's no such thing as blame, and that punishment and retribution and vengeance and stuff are always indefensible, right? I think a lot of the time what we see when we see bad people that have done bad things, when we see them go to jail, there's something kind of righteous that we feel. We feel like they were given their just desserts in some regard. And you need to use it as a tool of discouragement for other people to do it in future. It needs to be a societal signal. But we also know that it's only like a bit okay at that. There's many people who don't care about whether or not they get caught. Many people who almost prefer to be in jail than prefer to be outside. People who've become so habituated to their existence in there. So what does this do to a law system that needs to be able to protect us from people that are going to do bad things if we are not the conscious agents that have caused the actions that we're now being prosecuted for?
Well, sort of the nuanced response I have to that is the entire damn system is irrational and medieval and has to be completely abolished, because it's premised on the notion that it is okay to punish people for things over which they had no control. And that, in passing, brings up the point you just made as to why this is so difficult. We like to punish. One of the most reliable releasers of dopamine in our brains is get to be righteously punishing of someone. That's going to be an uphill battle, because that feels good when we think like we're doing it for the right reasons. But the criminal justice system makes no sense at all. Even the reformist versions of reconciliation ceremonies and compensatory actions on the part of people who have done harm to better understand their victims, and their victims to better understand them. All of those are premised on bleeding heart liberal versions of, the system could be a lot less brutal and could work better. The system makes no sense at all, because it is predicated on the starting notion of it's a just world in which people are punished for things they had no control over. And that's the only possible logical outcome. So this is where people freak out and, oh no, murderers running around on the streets. And all you have to apply is the same public health quarantine model that you do with a car whose brakes don't work. You keep it in there, but that doesn't mean you dent the hood viciously every single day to make it a better car afterward. It doesn't mean that.
What does this look like practically? Like what does this mean when it's not a car?
Okay. Yes, Chris, correct. It's a fantastic metaphor. The broken down car that gets put into the garage. And the reason I like it so much is because inadvertently, it highlights the real motivations and the real repercussions behind a worldview like this. Here's the view. You're not a conscious agent with free will and the ability to choose between right and wrong. You are a biological machine. And because of that, you must be taken out and away from society in order to be isolated and recalibrated before you're allowed to re-enter society. Now, there's some problems with that Sapolsky fails to address. First, if the universe is random and devoid of purpose and meaning as he claims it is, who are the people that Sapolsky believes should be given the right to enforce ideas of right and wrong? Right and wrong is just a different way of saying good and evil, and good and evil implies a telos to the universe, a purpose, a design. And if there is no purpose, and if it's all just chemistry and human life is nothing but a thermodynamic random walk, then there is no right and wrong to be enforced here in the first place. Now, it sounds to me like Sapolsky is envisioning a sort of quarantine protocol that requires some sort of surgical or medical intervention to alter your behavior if you step out of line. But who are the technicians that are going to be performing that? And why are they not also just random automata? I don't understand that at all. Now, what's interesting is there's an obvious set of interests that this view lends itself to. This is very conducive to the same political interests that drove pandemic lockdowns, the World Economic Forum initiatives, and all the rest of that. And I think Sapolsky has identified the need to supply the appearance of a scientific credence and superiority and legitimacy to those interests of those organizations. And that is the motivation, in my opinion, that has been behind the past 5 years of his work. He's seen where the political landscape is going, and he wants to get out in front of it.
Okay, we do one version of this like all the time with a type of human who's dangerous. They're dangerous, and if you don't keep them like confined in a way that they can't get access to other people, people are going to be harmed by them.
The question is, who defines danger? Again, I can't understand how reductionist materialists claim to believe anything other than a survival of the fittest model, because if ethics are just a construct of the human brain, which we claim they are, and the brain is supposed to be just this random product of chemical interactions, then why would you trust anything that that brain produces? If your computer, for example, lacked an intelligent design, and if it just operated on the basis of some random binary, you wouldn't use that computer. You wouldn't trust it. That's a metaphor I learned from John Lennox. But let's put all that aside. There are plenty of examples throughout history of people who held positions of power wrongly accusing others of being dangerous and problematic and having them eliminated. The witch trials in New England and Europe come to mind. Pandemic lockdown measures most recently. Who's putting who at risk? We're not completely certain, but what we know is there is an in-group and an out-group. And if somebody gains control of that political mechanism, then they have every right to eliminate or to isolate and quarantine and lock down the opposition that they disagree with.
And what is this? This is when your 5-year-old has a cold and you keep them home from kindergarten because they're going to get the other kids sick from sneezing. And we've all learned that as a quarantine containment strategy. And we're all able to protect kindergartners from sneezy kids with runny noses. And there's no judgment. There's no responsibility. You don't keep your kid home because they deserve not to be able to see their friends that day. You don't say you can't play with your toys because, the way you're sneezing, don't you care about how you're going to harm other people? Whoa, we've managed to do that, and we keep kindergartners safe from nose colds, and society hasn't fallen apart. We've subtracted out a notion of responsibility, and society not only functions, it functions better because kindergartners not only don't get sick, but you don't tell 5-year-olds they've got like the evil demon in there that's making them sneeze or something.
What about people that would say, Robert, that sounds an awful lot like jail to me? That's what we do. We take the people that have done bad things and we put them in a quarantined building along with other people who also have the same bad things for a period of time, and then we let them out?
No, because it's a world of difference from quarantine. For one thing, what you do with quarantine, what your moral imperative is to figure out exactly what you need to do to keep people safe from this individual, and not a smidgen more, not an inch more than that. Because there's no reason to take away your child's toys just because they have a nose cold. You do the absolute minimum that is needed. In addition, you don't moralize about it. This is simply a containment strategy. And finally, what you do, and you get all of society to look at it that way. I mean, we've gotten to the point where, a kid who's sneezing, we don't view them as a moral blight. But yeah, don't bring them to kindergarten tomorrow. They're going to get my kid sick, and that's going to be a disaster.
Hold on. Dr. Sapolsky, that's a weak analogy, sir. Colds, flus, viruses, these are sicknesses that are caused by an external vector, and they pass with time. A child that gets a cold is not inherently a sick child, and an outside microbe that has temporarily impaired their immune system will pass. That's a completely different set of circumstances from your claim of a dangerous individual who doesn't have any free will, because that determined behavior that individual possesses is not in their control. It's inherent to them. There is no external cause that's warping their behavior or impairing their ability to make decisions. In your view, they are biologically determined to behave that way, and they have no control over that behavior. The behavior will always be hardwired into them. That's your claim. Their cold, to use your metaphor, will not pass unless their biological machinery is altered. And I'm guessing you would be envisioning some sort of gene therapy or neural implants or something like that. So, okay, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. This is getting a little bit reductive. He goes into more analogies like that. He also goes into schizophrenia a little bit, which is a disease that modern healthcare still hasn't really made progress on. So a lot of the claims are neither here nor there, but let's skip a little bit ahead.
This myth of the self-made man, all of the rest of it, I've made a lot of changes to the way that I exist and the things that I do and the texture of my mind. And I've made lots of changes over the last 6 years. And it does sound to me quite disempowering and quite disquieting to hear I didn't choose to do any of that. All of the effort that I thought that I deployed wasn't mine to choose. My capacity to have that effort wasn't mine to choose. My desire to and choice to put my foot on the pedal of whatever that effort is wasn't mine to choose. And the executive function to piece it all together into a structured, ordered, organizational framework to do it also wasn't mine to choose or to deploy. It makes for quite a sad world as someone that wants to try and become something.
It sure does, which is why this is totally depressing. And yet, this is actually a good thing. I mean, for starters, everything I just said about the criminal justice system, just like say opposite words in the same sentences, and it applies exactly the same to meritocracy. It is just as irrational and just as in need of being like chunked all together, because like the other side of this being like a horrible, unjust world is that we reward people for things they had no control over. And they come out feeling entitled and feeling like they've earned it. And so that's got to go also. Okay, so what's the equivalent panic to, oh, great, so you're just going to have like murderers running around in the streets saying, oh, great, you're just going to have like a randomly selected person taking out your brain tumor. No, like you got to have like skilled people be neurosurgeons, and some people can gain those skills and other people not. And like you need to have competent people doing stuff. And just as like you keep dangerous people from hurting people, you keep incompetent people from hurting people as well. And like your neurosurgeons will still have to go through a lot of training and all of that.
But that means the incentives need to be there, right? You have to have the incentives in order to be able to justify them going through all of the training and doing the hard things.
Yeah, and what we went through was like the usual incentives for punishment have to be subtracted out because incentives are built around you're a rotten person and you could be cured, go talk to the chaplain or whatever. And the same thing in the case of the like brain surgeon flipped the other way. Um, like the only logical conclusion is thank God they're capable of doing this, but they're not a better human because they can do this. They're not entitled to have their needs in life considered more than anyone else's. So where do incentives come from? Major, like, oh my God, it's like almost Buddhist crap this guy's going on about right now. We're motivated by the desire to attain prestige and power and respect and entitlement and all of that. And in the case of like how they were talking about those poor unfortunates not blessed by lady luck back there, um, what we have to take pleasure from is we were one of the lucky ones to feel gratitude for that.
So that sounds like a religious claim to me. That's not a biological claim. Biology is about an organism's competence within a niche. And if those organisms prove competent, then they get to pass their genes on to the next generation. And if they're incompetent, then their genes die with them. That's survival of the fittest 101. That's Darwinism. Now, the Christian view, the religious view, is that we're all made in the image of God. And because of that, each and every one of us has an inherent worth that isn't reliant on our abilities or our circumstances. So that's a religious claim right there that he just made.
That has to be a source of like, okay, cool. Turns out it looks like I'm one of those people who has the potential to like be able to go save a lot of lives.
To interject there, why should you feel gratitude for something that you had no choice in it happening?
Because you lucked out. You're not living on the streets.
That's it. You lucked out. The universe is random and meaningless, and you're a biological robot and capable of making your own decisions. Nothing that you can do can change that, but you should be grateful because your meat sack that you've been given is a little bit more enjoyable to be in than somebody else's meat sack. So just be grateful for that.
You lucked out.
I've got the balance sheet in my mind of the degree of pleasure that people have from feeling like they authored their own successes compared with the degree of pleasure that they have from feeling like they just rolled a double six.
Yeah, this is asinine. This is like utopian beyond words. But like somewhere in there, we recognize that like there's a certain amount of irrational attribution of acclaiming someone when they turn out to be 7'4" tall and they're amazing in the NBA. Okay, that kind of, that may begin to explain why they're in the NBA and I'm not, kind of thing. Oh yeah, that one, we've gotten to the point in society that one has something to do with versions of like your growth hormone receptors. And that was not a moral like triumph to grow tall enough to play in the NBA. We can kind of deal with that. And, society hasn't fallen apart. We can subtract out praise for somebody growing to be that height, and the world doesn't collapse. And it's a much more accurate assessment. But what we're getting at here is like this enormous false dichotomy we do in our heads, which is like, most people don't believe in infinite free will. They say, yeah, there's stuff we have no control over. Like, not everyone gets to be 7'4". Not everybody gets to have perfect pitch. Not everybody gets to have the right glutamate receptor makeup so that they've got an amazing memory. And, there's luck. There's the biological attributes that we get gifted with or cursed with. And there's that stuff, yeah, we had no control over. But what we do with those attributes. Do we strive? Do we show tenacity and gumption? Do we, like, when the going gets tough, do we get going, or do we squander our gifts? Do we indulge ourselves and miss opportunity? That's the measure of who we are. That's this like totally false dichotomy that our attributes are made of biology, and like what we do, it is made of fairy dust, whether like that tests our souls. And
Okay, so this is a sign of a bad argument. He just constructed a straw man, but he set up the dilemma correctly here. Some people are born to be 7'4", and they don't choose that height. That's just how the chips fell for them. Now, there's an important point here. We don't celebrate an NBA player because they're tall. We praise them and we celebrate them because they use their height as an advantage in the context of a competitive game that people enjoy watching and are willing to spend money on to see, more importantly. So there's no cultural value in being tall in itself. Tall people are actually mocked more than they are celebrated unless they use that trait for something noteworthy and something that's societally accepted as being of value. But let's put that aside for a second. I wonder how all those NBA players who are tall, who did work their whole lives to practice their craft, exercise discipline, sacrificed, made the right decisions all throughout their childhood to put themselves in a position where they can achieve their dreams and make millions of dollars playing a game they love. I wonder what they would think about this claim of Sapolsky's that all the blood, all the sweat, the tears, the early mornings, the late nights, all that's just fairy dust. They didn't earn any of that. They didn't actually deserve to be treated or compensated better or worse than anyone else, and they don't deserve the fruits of their labors. I wonder how those NBA players would receive that message. Okay, let's skip a little bit ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that taking the free will red pill is something that hurts people who have much to be proud of, but benefits people who currently have much to be kind of despondent about. It's like a flattening way. It's the ultimate egalitarian philosophy, right? It's as flat gets.
yeah, because if you do the impossible and really, really think this way all the time, and I sure as hell can't, but the only logical conclusion from this is none of us are entitled to anything more than any other human on earth. There's no person out there whose needs are entitled to less consideration than yours.
So I understand that, but from a practical consideration, if we're talking about the importance of incentives in order to be able to get people who have the predisposition or the capacity to be able to deploy that in the right way, presumably we can't just red pill free will into all of the potential budding brain surgeons out there so that they know, even though I only get paid the same as the guy who has bottom of the barrel conscientiousness and just smokes weed and does Xbox all day, because he didn't choose that and I didn't choose this, it should be my duty to ignore the lack of incentive in this new world of UBI or something like free will based universal basic income. I'm guessing that that's not your proposal for like a society structure.
Well, good luck with that. Yeah, that's not going to be easy. On the other hand, we've got a world where from very early on in life, we're training kids with cultural myths that are exactly the opposite. I don't know if we put a lot of work into teaching people to just recognize it is sheer utter chance that they wound up being who they are. And if you had the good luck, some gratitude would be a good thing. Okay, my Christ, I'm going to bring Joan Baez in here in a moment on like her walker or something to talk about the utopian, yeah, but we do it in little bits and pieces. Like there's like Hallmark cards you can get and give to somebody that says, well, what's it? Thank you for being you. Like, oh, come on. Thank you for you having been the lucky one to have turned out the way you are and happening to like be my spouse. Or, yeah, it's going to be really hard. And I can function this way less than 1% of the time. And I constantly show that, like, amid believing this stuff, I'm a total hypocrite because I can't really act on it emotionally. The vast majority. But every now and then, when it really, really, really matters.
Okay, so I want to stop it right here and touch on something he said earlier in the video. That's a really important takeaway for me. So he said he admitted he can't act on this view emotionally, and he can only function on it less than 1% of the time. And that's really interesting language. There's a basic tenet of science. Science works on the premise of theories and models. And there's a common misconception there, because science doesn't try to produce truth claims. Science is the attempt to construct models and theories around a hypothesis that fail to be disproven otherwise. And if they pass that test, then they're deemed useful, not inherently true. The theory of gravity, for example, is not a truth claim that gravity per se exists. It's a model of how the universe might work that has failed to be disproven and has proven to be useful, more importantly. And that usefulness test, the test for scientific claims, is also useful for ideas. Any theory that you can't actually act on, if it's untenable for life and if it's not useful, then by definition, it isn't a valid theory, regardless of its theoretical merits, because theories have to be tested and lived out in the real world through experience. And if they don't work in the real world, then they're useless. So let's skip a little bit ahead. Let's see what he has to say at the end.
So can you provide people with some glimmer of a white pill that makes them feel a little bit less despondent about the fact that, why shouldn't I just not do anything, all of the things? Because I do think, even if en masse and over a long enough time span, people end up just going back to their sort of habituated routine with a slightly ambient Sapolsky in the back of their mind, reminding them that they're not the architect of their own successes. It's uncomfortable, right? To genuinely try and grapple with this. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable in the same way as realizing that eating factory farmed animal products is basically like paying sentient creatures to be tortured for your pleasure. And people need a little bit of help to get them across the line. Do you have any Viagra to help them get through this slightly difficult situation?
Well, this once again is going to be a pretty lame answer. Amid the absolutism of there's no free will whatsoever, all of that, like, go do something incremental once a week when you realize you're about to judge somebody and harshly, like, don't. Or once a week when you're like making, pounding on the desk of some poor bastard where you're insisting that you had an appointment and you're important and they're delaying you, or whatever. Like, do one of those things once a week. Like, at some point, like, look at somebody very different from you and really try and exercise, and they had absolutely nothing to do with how they wound up, or, a little instead of small random acts of kindness, small random acts of rejecting free will. And like, okay, I can't do much better than that, but like, go do that. Go do that every now and then.
Okay, so all of these examples of these small random acts of rejecting free will, it sounds a lot to me like exercising your free will to make choices to treat people in a different way than how you would generally treat them. He said, once you realize you're about to judge somebody harshly, don't. That sounds to me a lot like he's asking people to make a choice to treat others with kindness. Now, let's use a scenario here and just say, I'm not, biologically speaking, predetermined to act that way, to use his line of thinking. I'm one of these Sapolskyan broken down cars that need to be fixed, right? Or am I just one of the downtrodden unfortunates whose shortcomings have now been liberated and justified because of this worldview? Like, who is going to claim that me treating someone nicely is incorrect or correct? I'm so lost. And I think, honestly, Sapolsky is too. Look, when I watch this interview, there's a verse from the Bible that comes to my mind, and it's a verse about wolves in sheep's clothing. They come to you innocent and harmless, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. And I'm not going to go as far to say that Sapolsky himself fits this bill, but I will say that his idea about free will specifically is absolutely a wolf in sheep's clothing. He seems like an affable, unassuming, kind-hearted professor, but the ideas that he's trying to present, they have a lot of gaps in them, a lot of dangerous gaps, I would propound. And I'm not sure if he even realizes that. I reached out to him to ask him to come on my podcast. His people said that he was booked, and I understand that. But Dr. Sapolsky, you're welcome to come on at any time and talk, and I would be willing to have a honest, truthful, congenial, and open debate with you on this matter. But I was also a little disappointed that Chris didn't press Sapolsky a little bit harder on some of these things. But Sapolsky's a big name, and I understand that you don't want to alienate a guest and make them feel like their views aren't welcome. So that's all for now. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.